What exactly is heresy? Well, if we go all the way back to the Greek hieresis, it means a choice, a school of thought, or a sect. And for most of the first century of Christianity, it simply described any distinctive theological position without necessarily implying condemnation. In fact, Paul used it to describe the factions within the Corinthian church, not to condemn them. The word became a weapon only as Christianity developed institutional mechanisms, creeds, councils, bishops with enforcement powers, and eventually emperors with armies. What heresy means in this account is the historical verdict of whichever faction had the institutional authority to use it. And this is the frame that will remain consistently, because this account includes living communities, you see, Coptic, Armenian, Assyrian, Waldensian, the Ethiopians. Their ancestors were condemned by councils that no longer speak with the authority they once had. But calling their theology heresy today would be a little bit strange. Perhaps it's a historical description, but it's not a verdict. The distinction matters, and we'll be maintaining it. Now, before we do begin, two exclusions require explanation up front. The Protestant Reformation will not appear in this account, not because it is less interesting than what precedes it, but because it's a subject of sufficient scale and complexity that folding it into, a 10-minute entry wouldn't really do it much of a justice. Separate video on the Protestant Reformation later. Our time together today will end at the door that the Reformation walks through. The East-West Schism of 1054 will not appear either. Mutual excommunication between equals is more of a rupture, not a heresy in the technical sense that the word requires. With the boundaries established, what we're going to talk about today is about 15 centuries of theological dispute, violence, and frankly quite remarkable individuals that made it all happen on both sides. And of course the slow discovery that the list of heretics is partly a list of people history later wished had been argued with instead of violently killed. So, let's begin. Every major heresy movement explained. And before we do, quick reminder, we are crowd-funded, crowd-supported, no ads, no sponsors, which means if you want to support us and keep us going, follow links in the pinned comment and video description, Patreon, donations, YouTube memberships, etc. If you don't, that's fine. Like, comment, and subscribe. Completely free. Helps us out. Okay, let's begin. Thanks for your patience. Let's start in the 1st century with Simon Magus. In the 8th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, a man named Simon, who had impressed the people of Samaria with his magical abilities and had accepted baptism from Philip, offered the apostles Peter and John a bit of money in exchange for the power to confer the Holy Spirit by the laying on of hands. Peter's response was not good. Quote, "May your silver perish with you." Simon's name gave the English language the word simony, by the way, the purchase of church office, which has already appeared in this coverage of the anti-popes that we did a few videos back. This is essentially everything the New Testament tells us about him. Don't go too much into him, but certainly the namesake leaves quite a legacy. Suppose we can all agree on that. The Church Fathers did considerably more with the material. Irenaeus, writing in the late 2nd century, identified Simon Magus as the fountainhead of all subsequent Gnostic heresy. He was the first to corrupt the apostolic teaching, arch-deceiver from whom every subsequent deviation came from. Certainly not the legacy he wanted, right? He was said to have a companion named Helen, a former prostitute he claimed was the divine thought incarnate, the Ennoia. He was said to have died attempting to fly in Rome. That's right. He tried to be a bit of ahead of his time, I think. He became, in patristic literature, the all-purpose origin story for heterodox Christianity. The point of this entry is not what Simon actually did, which is essentially unrecoverable, we just don't know, but what the tradition did with him. You see, heresy needed an origin story, a point which the rot began, the first mover. Simon Magus was recruited for that role. Every subsequent account of heresy, beginning with a single deceiving individual, owes something to this legend. The Church Fathers' construction of Simon as the arch-heretic also reveals something about how the early Christian tradition processed its own competitive landscape. By locating the origin of all Gnostic error in a single historical figure, i.e. a figure who appears in the canonical Acts giving the apostolic error credentials, the tradition created a genealogy of deviation that mapped clearly onto the apostolic authority it was simultaneously constructing. Just as the apostles handed authority to their successors in unbroken line, Simon handed down his errors to them. The parallelism was useful. It made the Gnostic movements into a counter-tradition with a counter-apostolic succession, which gave the Orthodox tradition a clear structure to condemn. Now, of course, there's always arguments about Simon, whether Simon actually taught anything resembling what Irenaeus attributed to him, but at this point it's irrelevant to the function. He served it dead as well as he could have served it living. And once again, his legacy is what it is, regardless of how he feels about it. Well, next we have Gnosticism in general, and that's a bit of a blanket term, because it's not a single movement, but a group of related movements sharing certain characteristic structures of thought, kind of like how the word shamanism is used as a blanket term for those kinds of spirituality, but it's not really correct when we get into characterizations of individual cases. Well, the name comes from gnosis, the Greek word for knowledge. Not the ordinary knowledge of facts and skills, but the deep, salvific knowledge of the self and divine origin. The Gnostic systems vary enormously in their specifics, but they share in most versions a fundamental cosmic dualism. The material world is not the creation of the highest God, but the botched or malevolent work of a lesser divine being called the demiurge, from the Greek word for craftsman. Now this demiurge, often identified with the God of the Old Testament, the one who made the world, claimed it was good, and demanded obedience for it, is ignorant of the higher divine realm, the pleroma, the fullness, the realm of pure spirit, from which humans are ultimately descended, and which the pneumatics, the spiritual people, those with divine sparks, can return through knowledge. Among the most sophisticated Gnostic teachers was Valentinius, who taught in Alexandria and then in Rome in the mid-2nd century, and came remarkably close to becoming Bishop of Rome. Some accounts say that he lost an election there. His system is extraordinarily elaborate. 30 divine beings called aeons, arranged in pairs within the pleroma. The youngest aeons fall, producing the material world, Christ descending to restore the scattered sparks of light to their origin. The Sethians offer a different version centered on Seth, Adam's third son, as the ancestor of the spiritual race. Both systems drew extensively on Jewish scripture, Greek philosophy, and the emerging Christian tradition, creating synthesis that their opponents found both alarming and impressive. On the 19th of December 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, struck a sealed ceramic jar. Inside were 13 codices, bound books, not scrolls, containing 52 texts, most of them unknown, and these were the documents the Orthodox Church had described, condemned, and attempted to destroy. Now the Gnostics could speak in their own words for the first time in over 1500 years. The Gospel of Thomas offers 114 sayings attributed to Jesus, some closely parallel to the Synoptic Gospels and some radically divergent. The Gospel of Philip is a meditation on the sacraments and the divine feminine. The Gospel of Truth, possibly by Valentinus himself, is a homily of genuine literary beauty. The Apocryphon of John provides the most systematic Gnostic cosmology. Reading them, it becomes quite clear that what was suppressed was not primitive confusion, but sophisticated theological reflection by people who had read widely and thought hard. Whether their conclusions were correct is a theological question, and theology is going to be different for everyone. Whether they were serious is not a question at all. They obviously were. Now, the Church Fathers' campaign against the Gnostics produced some of the most important early Christian writings. Irenaeus of Lyons' Against Heresies, written around 180, is our primary source for the Gnostic systems he is refuting, which is why patristic scholarship has always required reading hostile witnesses with some caution. Tertullian, Hippolytus, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen all engaged this Gnostic tradition extensively, and the engagement forced orthodoxy to clarify its own positions on creation, scripture, and Christology in ways that would define Western Christianity for the centuries that followed. Gnosticism lost the institutional argument. The questions it raised, however, did not just go away overnight. The Nag Hammadi discovery is worth talking about a little more because its circumstances are quite remarkable. The 12 codices and fragments were found by a farmer named Muhammad Ali Saman, just digging around in the desert, kind of reminiscent of the Rosetta Stone find. And he apparently used some of the papyrus pages as fuel before the significance of the find was recognized. I wish he hadn't have done that, but he did. Very, very wasteful. Now, the texts were eventually acquired by the Coptic Museum in Cairo, suppressed for political reasons during the 1950s, while scholars who had seen them argued about access and publication rights, and finally fully published only in 1977. The span from discovery to full publication is 32 years. 32 years during which texts that had been buried since probably the 4th century sat in various institutional hands while their significance was being negotiated. The Gnostics had been silenced for 1,500 years. They then waited another 3 decades while the Academy managed their reappearance. The specific questions that Gnosticism raised have provided more durable than the have proved more durable than the institutional forms that carried them. And then there's that question, how did evil enter a world made by a good God? If God is omnipotent and good, why does innocent suffering exist? Is the material world simply indifferent to human spiritual aspiration, or is it actively hostile? All pretty basic questions in theological terms. And I guess they're not questions that the Orthodox tradition managed to resolve. It declared that certain answers were unacceptable and then offered alternative answers whose own difficulties the tradition spent centuries managing. Gnostic answers, i.e. a flawed creator, a higher God beyond creation, a soul's origin in a spiritual realm above the material one, They are not self-evidently worse than the orthodox alternative, and I suppose at least the Gnostics are trying. I mean, people want an answer, right? Well, these answers are simply the ones that lost the institutional argument in the 3rd and 4th centuries, which I suppose is a different kind of inadequacy. Next up, we have Marcion of Sinope, son of a bishop, who made his fortune as a ship owner and arrived in Rome around 139 with a significant donation for the church there. He spent several years developing his theology before formally presenting it. And when he did, it was not taken very well. He was expelled from the Roman community in 144, and get this, they were so angry that they even gave his donation back. They didn't want his money. Well, his position was pretty radical and internally coherent. The God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were not the same thing. Yes, they wouldn't have liked that. Now, the creator God of Genesis, who demands blood sacrifice, commands genocide, and makes and breaks covenants with particular peoples, is a just but harsh and limited deity, the maker of the material world. Now, the higher God whom Christ reveals is entirely different. A God of love, unknown before Christ's arrival, unburdened by the histories of the Old Testament, because he had no involvement in them. The good news of the gospel is that this higher God has intervened to rescue humanity from the world the demiurge made. It's an interesting theory, and not the first time this has been said either. You'll see as we move along. Marcion was not a Gnostic in the full sense. He had no elaborate cosmological mythology, no secret knowledge, and no theory of divine sparks imprisoned in matter. He was just a systematic biblical theologian who had read both testaments carefully and concluded that the Old Testament God couldn't be the same as the New Testament one. His practical consequence was equally radical. He compiled what appears to be the first Christian canon, consisting of a version of the Gospel of Luke, purged of Jewish elements that he regarded as interpolations, and 10 letters of Paul. The canon forced the mainstream church to do something it had been avoiding for a while, and that was to define its own. The process of canonization that produced the New Testament we have is in part a response to Marcion's challenge. He had a rival church with its own bishops, its own sacramental life and communities, probably the largest and most geographically widespread Christian alternative to the Catholic Church in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Tertullian wrote 5 books against him, which is a measure of how seriously he was taken. The Marcionite canon-making process also forced a specifically Jewish question into the open that the mainstream church had preferred to manage rather than resolve. And that is, what is the relationship between the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian gospel? The mainstream answer, that the 2 testaments form a continuous redemptive narrative, the Old Testament pointing forward to and being fulfilled in the New. It required the sustained interpretive effort and the development of an allegorical reading tradition. Marcion's answer that they describe different gods in the Old Testament could simply be thrown aside, basically. It was a lot cleaner, but theologically catastrophic for the church's relationship with the synagogue and its own Jewish heritage. This interpretive framework developed to refute Marcion. Typology, allegory, and the economy of salvation became central to Christian biblical reading for the next 2 millennia. I don't know. It's up to me. I don't really care too much about the Old Testament anyway. So I don't think that Marcion was doing anything wrong. I don't know. Let me know what you think about it. Next up we have the Ebionites, their name probably deriving from the Hebrew avion, meaning the poor ones, though the etymology of that is debated. They were Jewish Christians who maintained the Torah observance, things like circumcision, dietary law, and the Sabbath. They rejected Paul of Tarsus as an apostate from Judaism who had distorted the original teaching of Christ. They understood Jesus as a fully human prophet and a teacher, the greatest of the prophets, perhaps the Messiah, but not divine in the sense that would later be defined at Nicaea. Their Christ was a man whom the Spirit of God empowered at his baptism, and that's where it ended. The Ebionites represent the road not taken, the earliest Christianity practiced by people who had known or been close to the historical Jesus, maintaining their Jewish identity while following his teaching. Their gradual disappearance, squeezed between a rabbinic Judaism that rejected the Jesus claim and the Gentile majority church that rejected the Torah claim. It is one of the structural tragedies of the early Christian history, because they left almost no documents of their own. What we know comes from sources who regard them as heretics. The recognitions and homilies attributed to Clement of Rome contain material scholars associate with Ebionite circles, but the identification is contested. They are the most complete illustration of a principle that, quote, orthodoxy is what survives, and survival depended on factors that had little to do with being close to Jesus. The Ebionites preserve evidence of a moment in early Christianity that the subsequent tradition essentially erased, the period when the followers of Jesus were overwhelmingly Jewish and expected to remain so. Paul's mission to the Gentiles, and particularly his insistence that Gentile converts do not need to undergo genital mutilation or observe the Torah, was the theological revolution the Ebionites resisted. Their reading of Paul as an apostate was not paranoid. Paul himself, in Galatians, describes being opposed by a people who insisted on circumcision for Gentile converts, and identifies them as associated with the Jerusalem church. The Ebionite tradition is, in this reading, the theological position of the Jerusalem church, as it would have looked from outside Paul's orbit. That position lost the argument, not because it was scripturally weaker than Paul's. The Torah's authority in Jesus' own practice was substantial, but because the demographic future of Christianity was Gentile, and moving away from the earlier Bronze Age traditions. Around 165 in Phrygia, the central plateau of what is now Turkey, a man named Montanus began speaking in ecstatic utterances he attributed directly to the Holy Spirit. He was joined by two women, Priscilla and Maximilla, who were also the vehicles of prophetic speech. And so, from 165, begins Montanism. Their movement called itself the New Prophecy, and its core claim was the age of direct divine revelation had not closed with the apostles. The Paraclete, i.e. the Spirit, Comforter promised in John's Gospel, was continuing to speak through living prophets, and what these prophets said carried the authority of Scripture. The end was imminent. The New Jerusalem would descend at Pepusa in Phrygia, and the faithful should gather there and prepare for the inevitable. Big claims, very big. The mainstream church's response was obviously quite cautious. Ecstatic prophecy was a recognized phenomenon in the early church, and simply condemning it was theologically awkward. The objections that accumulated were practical as much as doctrinal. The prophet's manner of speaking, the elevation of their utterances to scriptural status, and the rigorism of their ascetic demands, the specific geography the promised apocalypse. The most striking fact about Montanism is its most famous convert, Tertullian of Carthage. Now, he was the most important Latin Christian writer of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, who joined the new prophecy sometime around 206, and remained associated with it for the rest of his life. He wrote some of the most important works as a Montanist. His adherence tells you that in the late 2nd century, the boundaries of acceptable Christianity were still loose enough that a man of his intellectual caliber and theological commitment could find Montanus' claims to be credible. Well, the prophets died. The New Jerusalem did not descend on Phrygia. But Montanist communities persisted in Asia Minor for several centuries, the most durable testament to the movement's genuine vitality. The Montanist controversy also first forced the early church to address a question it had been avoiding. Was the age of prophecy closed? The answer that the mainstream traditions settled on, that the apostolic period had been unique and its own canonical testimony was sufficient, had enormous consequences for how subsequent Christian movements were evaluated. Any claim to direct divine communication, to prophecy, new revelation, would now carry the taint of Montanism. The tradition that ran from Montanus through the medieval visionaries, the Franciscan spirituals, Savonarola, and eventually the charismatic movements of the 20th century, is a tradition that kept returning to the question Montanus raised, and that the institutional church kept answering with suspicion. The question of whether the Spirit continues to speak in new ways, in the long view, is the most durable theological controversy that the new prophecy opened. And once you open that up, good luck closing it. Next up we have Adoptionism of the 2nd to 3rd centuries. Theodotus, the leather merchant, came to Rome from Byzantium around 190 and taught that Jesus was a human being, born of a virgin in a biological sense, but purely human in his nature, who was subsequently empowered, adopted, by the divine spirit at his baptism when the dove descended. Bold claim, right? He was basically saying that the Spirit's presence did not make him God, it made him the supreme instrument of God's purpose. He was excommunicated by Pope Victor. Later Paul of Samosata, the Bishop of Antioch in the 260s rather, taught a similar position with greater philosophical sophistication. The divine Logos indwelled Jesus as wisdom indwells a wise human being, not as a distinct divine person, but as an empowering divine quality. Paul was deposed at the Council of Antioch in 268. Adoptionism has an obvious scriptural logic. You see, the voice at the baptism says, "This is my beloved Son," which could imply a conferral, a cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It implies a possible separation between the divine and human that an eternally divine Christ would not experience. The theological tradition that would become orthodoxy resolved these passages through interpretation. The adoptionists resolved them more literally. The position kept returning dynamic Monarchianism, as the theologians called it, meaning the theology that preserved the monarchy, the sole sovereignty of God, by treating Christ as human, elevated rather than the divine being descended. It would be condemned repeatedly because it kept making too much sense to too many people, which is obviously a big problem. Now, dynamic Monarchianism, the technical name for adoptionism, had the specific example of explaining the Gospel's most humanly vivid moments without requiring this complicated metaphysical theory of two natures. For example, if Jesus wept at the tomb of Lazarus, the monarchian could say a human being was just expressing human emotion. And everyone can understand that, right? Of course, a dead person, a living person, it's sad. If he asked why God had forsaken him, the monarchian could say, it's a human being in extreme stress. And like they all say, there's no atheists in the foxholes, right? Push comes to shove, everyone's praying, right? Well, the Orthodox tradition required either interpretation through the lens of the divine nature, i.e. the tears were real, but the divine nature was impassible, incapable of suffering, that is, or a full theory of how divine and human nature related in one person, i.e. the Chalcedonian definition, which took 4 centuries to produce. We'll talk a bit about that later. So adoptionism required neither of these. If the Gospels, at their most straightforward reading, could be understood, then of course people are going to grab onto that because it's just easy. And that's why Paul of Samosata had a genuinely impressive following among people who thought that the Nicene theology was overcomplicated. Too many moving parts. The average man on the street doesn't really get it. And that's why the position just kept reasserting itself under various names. Next up we have Sabellianism / Modalism from the early 3rd century. Sabellius, active in Rome in the early 3rd century, taught the position that would become known as Modalism or Patripassanianism. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not 3 distinct persons within the Godhead, but rather 3 modes or faces, prosopa in Greek, a word that also means theatrical masks. So basically 3 different modes of a divine being. God presents as Father when creating, as Son when redeeming, as Spirit when sanctifying. The divine unity is absolute, of course. There's no separation. His opponents called this position Sabellian, and its most damaging implication was Patripassanianism. Basically, if the Father and the Son are the same person wearing different masks, then the Father suffered on the cross. Sabellius was condemned by Pope Calixtus I around 220, who was apparently not too impressed with his fancy new ideas. Now I suppose this entry exists primarily to frame what follows, understanding why the early church rejected both adoptionism and modalism. The former made Christ too human and the latter collapsed the persons of the Trinity into one, is essentially for the purpose of following the council wars of the following parts. Now, the space between these 2 rejected positions is the space in which the orthodox doctrine of the Trinity had to be constructed, and that construction required 4 more major councils, 2 centuries of argument, and the condemnation of everyone who paused too long at either end of the corridor. Got to make a decision. There is that old saying that if you stand in the middle of the road, you'll get hit from both sides. And you're going to see a little bit of that in, in this video. So the modalist temptation, i.e. to pull towards collapsing the 3 persons into one to preserve divine unity, has never entirely disappeared from popular Christian thought, which tends to approach the Trinity through analogies. Water as ice, as liquid and steam. A person as father, son, and husband. They're technically Sabellian rather than orthodox. The analogy of 3 modes or roles fits intuitive monotheism better than 3 co-equal persons sharing one substance, which is why the councils had to work so hard to establish the latter. The practical reality is that most Christians, asked to describe the Trinity, describe something that's actually closer to Sabellius than the actual Cappadocian Fathers. Of course, they can get away with doing it these days because we're not burning people anymore, at least at the time of making this video. Fingers crossed that does not change. In any case, the heresy condemned in the 3rd century is the lived theology of the majority of the 21st. It's just the way it is. Oh, I wonder if the old Sabellius could see us now, what he would say. I suppose we'll never know. Anyway, moving on. Well, the next one you might have heard of, Manichaeism, founded by Mani around 216 to 274. At least we know that Mani was born in 216 in Babylonia to a father who belonged to a Jewish Christian baptismal sect called the Elkasites. He received divine revelations beginning at the age of 12 and again at 24, at which point his angelic twin revealed to him that his was the final and universal religion, the synthesis that completed what Zoroaster, Buddha, and Jesus had each partially revealed. So he began preaching in 240, with the endorsement of the Sasanian Emperor Shapur I, and his religion spread immediately across the Persian Empire into the Roman world, until he was executed, probably crucified, by the successor of Shapur around 274. His followers called him the Apostle of Light, and believed his death was a martyrdom analogous to the crucifixion. The Manichaean system is one of the most systematically elaborated theologies of the ancient world. At its center is a primordial conflict between the realm of light and the realm of darkness. And I know, right? You'll hear a few echoes of Zoroastrianism within this. Hey, after all, they are in the right area. So the creation of the physical world is the consequence of an invasion. Particles of light became mixed with the dark, and the cosmos is the mechanism by which the light is slowly extracted and returned to its source. Human beings contain light particles. The material body is a prison. The elect, those who abstain from meat, wine, and sexual intercourse, accelerate the liberation process by the very act of eating fruit and vegetables, through which the light they contain passes into the elect's body and is purified. The hearers provide for the elect's material needs and accept slower liberation across multiple lifetimes. Jesus, Buddha, Zoroaster, and Mani himself are messengers of light descending from the realm of light to help with the extraction. Augustine of Hippo, who would become the most influential theologian in the history of Western Christianity, spent 9 years as a Manichaean hearer from his early 20s. He found the system intellectually satisfying. It had an answer for the problem of evil, the realm of darkness explaining it. It had a serious cosmology. It offered community and moral seriousness. His eventual disillusion with Manichaeism, prompted partly by the inadequacy of Mani's astronomical predictions and partly by the rather disappointingly unimpressive Manichaean bishop named Faustus of Milevis, led him towards Neoplatonism and eventually Catholic Christianity. His anti-Manichaean writings are among his most sustained theological works, and the concepts he developed in refuting Manichaeism, evil as privation for good rather than positive substance, the will as seat as sin, became foundational for Western theology. The reach of Manichaeism across time and space is extraordinary by any measure. Communities existed across the Roman Empire, in Persian Mesopotamia, Central Asia, and even along the Silk Road. The Uyghur Khaganate of Central Asia made Manichaeism its state religion in 762. Manichaean texts survive in Coptic, Latin, Greek, Syriac, Persian, Sogdian, Uyghur, Chinese, and other languages, discovered in manuscripts from Egypt to Western China. The last Manichaean communities in Fujian, in southern China, persisted into the 16th century, a tradition founded by Babylonia in 240 still maintaining itself in the Ming dynasty, 1200 years later, thousands of miles away. The Catholic Church fought Manichaeism as the arch-heresy for a millennium. The word Manichae became a general term of abuse applied to any dualist, any materialist skeptic, any persistent enemy of the faith and that slur outlasted the movement for centuries. The Manichaean legacy in Western thought operates primarily through Augustine, whose 9 years as a hero shaped his subsequent theology. His mature doctrine of evil, as well as the privation of good, was developed specifically against the Manichaean co-eternal realm of darkness. His insistence on the goodness of creation against the Manichaean rejection of matter shaped the whole tradition of incarnational theology in the Western Church. And his doctrine of the will as the seat of sin, corrupted not by matter, but by free choice in Adam's case and inherited defect in ours, is the alternative to the Manichaean explanation of evil that structured Western Christianity's distinctive account of human culpability. So Augustine refuted Mani, and Mani's question shaped what Augustine said when he was answering something else. Funny how that works. In 312, Constantine won the Battle of Milvian Bridge, and he attributed his victory to the Christian God. Within a decade, he had called the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the whole Church, and presided over it in person. The emperor was now in the room. Better be good. Everyone on their best behavior, of course. Now, heresy acquired something it had never before possessed: the possibility of state enforcement. A position condemned at council could now be backed by imperial exile, property confiscation, and, in some cases, execution if you're really unlucky. Now that changes the stakes of the theological argument irrevocably, but it also produced the peculiar phenomenon of imperial Christology. Different emperors had different theological positions, and the orthodox position seemed to shift with the throne. So the next group of heresies is going to trace these shifts and their consequences, from the Arian controversy that consumed the 4th century to the Monothelite compromise that ended with the Pope condemned by a council after his death. The institutional change produced by Constantine's conversion is worth stating plainly, because before 312, a Christian could hold heterodox views and face, at worst, excommunication from the community, but even that's a bit of a stretch. After 312, sure, you could face exile, but also confiscation of property, and they might even execute you. The same doctrinal disputes that had been fought with pamphlets and letters were now fought with legal decrees. Heresy became a criminal offense under Theodosius I in 380. The change did not make theological arguments more honest, it just made it more consequential, and what the councils decided was enforced, which meant that the difference between the winning formula and the losing formula was the difference between a bishop's see and a bishop's exile. The council theology that fills the next few ones are partly genuine intellectual engagement and partly about a high-stakes political process in which the prizes included territory, authority, and personal survival. So let's get into them. The Diocletianic persecution of 303 to 311, the last and most severe Roman persecution of Christians, included a specific demand that clergy surrender their scriptures to the authorities. Those who complied were called traditores in Latin, a word meaning handers over, from which the English word traitor derives. Now, when the persecution ended and the church reorganized, the question of what to do with clergy who had handed over the scriptures proved to be divisive in North Africa. The immediate controversy centered on Cecilian, elected Bishop of Carthage in 311. One of the bishops who consecrated him was allegedly a traitor. A rival group rallying behind Donatus declared the consecration invalid, and elected their own bishop. The Donatist position was precise. The validity of sacraments depended on the moral worthiness of the minister. A sacrament administered by a traitor is not worth anything, it's null and void. And then there was the Catholic counter position, developed most fully by Augustine. That was that sacraments derive their validity from Christ's institution, not from the moral character of the minister. The sacrament works ex opere operato, by the work performed, regardless of who performs it. The practical difference was enormous. Under the Donatist view, any lapse in clerical continuity could invalidate the entire sacramental chain. Under the Catholic view, the chain was unbreakable by human sin. The Donatists were not a fringe sect either. They actually dominated North African Christianity for generations. They had more bishops, more clergy, and more popular support than the Catholics in much of the region. The Circumcilians, the Donatist militants who protected their communities with clubs they called Israelites, and who sometimes provoked their own deaths to achieve martyrdom, are the movement's most alarming manifestations. Augustine's campaign against them produced the theory derived from Luke 14:23, compel them to come in, if you don't know, that coercion of heretics back to the true faith is a legitimate act of love. This is where the theology of religious coercion enters the Western tradition. The Donatist schism ended not because Augustine won the argument, but because the Vandal kingdom conquered North Africa in 429, and the Vandals, being Arian Christians themselves, were hostile to both Catholic and Donatist views in equal measure, basically. Now, the theological question of sacramental validity was resolved by conquest, not by any persuasion. The practical answer, the Catholic position, entered the tradition and has never left. The theoretical foundations of religious persecution built by Augustine in the same controversy also entered the tradition with consequences that run through the entire rest of our time together today. The specific question the Donatists raised, i.e., does the minister's moral character affect the sacrament's validity, has never been entirely put to rest in practice, whatever the official answer was. The Catholic tradition's official position in Augustine's, i.e., the sacrament is valid regardless of the minister's state. That still exists, of course. But the practical question of what to do about clergy who have committed serious sins, how to manage their ministry, whether to require their reordination, and how to treat the congregations they've ministered to, that is a question that recurs in every era of church discipline. The Donatist controversy's resolution settled the theological principle, but it didn't settle the pastoral problem, which is why the question the Donatists raised about the relationship between character and the sacramental authority continues to surface in every generation that discovers that its clergy are not what they appear to be. Well, next up we got the big one, Arianism. Arius of Alexandria was a presbyter, a senior priest, not a bishop, who around 318 began teaching a position that his bishop Alexander found quite intolerable. The Son of God is the greatest of all created beings, the instrument through whom God made everything else, but he is not co-eternal with the Father. There was, quote, when he was not. The Son had a beginning. Before the beginning he did not exist. He is therefore not, in the fullest sense, God himself. Arius had a talent for memorable formulations and a gift for popular communication. He put his theology into songs that became sung in the streets of Alexandria. He also had a strong scriptural support. John 14:28, the Father is greater than I. Proverbs 8:22, where wisdom says, quote, the Lord created me at the beginning of his work. Colossians 1:15, the firstborn of all creation, etc. The appeal of his position was that it preserved the strict monotheism, that there is one God, the Father, while giving full cosmic significance to Christ. Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea in 325, primarily to settle this dispute, which was dividing the Eastern Church with surprising ferocity. The council produced the Nicene Creed, crucially the term homoousios, of the same substance as the Father, to describe the Son. Now Arius and 2 bishops who refused to sign were exiled. Constantine, satisfied, assumed the matter was closed. But it was not closed. The Nicene formula was unclear enough on key technical points, and the political dynamics of the Eastern Church were complex enough that the next 50 years saw a sustained Arian, or at least semi-Arian movement that at various points came close to reversing the Nicene settlement entirely. Jerome wrote that when the Arian councils of the late 350s had done their work, quote, the world groaned to find itself Arian. Now this was hyperbole, but productive hyperbole. It shows the genuine disorientation of a period when the emperor's theological preference carried more weight than any council's decree. Constantius II, who ruled the Eastern Empire from 337 to 361, was an Arian sympathizer, and under his reign the Arian or semi-Arian position received quite a bit of imperial backing. Bishops who refused to compromise their Nicene theology, well, they got exiled. Pope Liberius, as seen in the anti-pope's account we did before, eventually signed a compromise formula. The Cappadocian, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nazianzus, and Gregory of Nyssa produced the theological synthesis that eventually broke the Arian hold, distinguishing between ousia, substance or essence of which there is one, and hypostasis, person or individual of subsistence, which there are 3. Now the Council of Constantinople in 381, under the Nicene sympathizing Emperor Theodosius I, ratified this formula and effectively ended Arianism as an imperial theological option, but not as a Gothic one. Wulfila, a Gothic bishop who had been consecrated by an Arian bishop in Constantinople, translated the Bible into Gothic in the 4th century, the first time a Germanic language had a written literature, essentially. He taught the Goths an Arian Christianity, and Arian Christianity spread among the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Burgundians, who would divide the Western Roman Empire among themselves in the 5th and 6th centuries. Theodoric's Ostrogothic kingdom of Italy was Arian, Visigothic Spain was Arian, and Vandal Africa was Arian and actively hostile to Catholic clergy. The, quote, heresy condemned at Nicaea in 325 became the Christianity of kingdoms that inherited Rome. The Visigothic king, Recured, converted to Catholicism in 589, the last major Arian kingdom making its peace with Rome. Between 325 and 589, the question of whether Arianism was heresy or orthodoxy was, depending on which territory you were in, genuinely open. Next up, we got a bit of a short one, the Pneumatomachians. The settlement of the Son's status at Nicaea immediately raised the next question. Well, we know about the Father and the Son, but what about the Holy Spirit? Well, the Pneumatomachians, the, quote, spirit fighters, accepted the Nicene formula for the relationship between Father and Son, but they denied that the Spirit was co-divine, co-equal, and co-eternal in the same sense. Some called the Spirit a high-ranking servant. The Cappadocian Fathers, particularly Basil of Caesarea, in his treatise on the Holy Spirit, argued that the Spirit's co-divinity followed necessarily from the Spirit's role in creation, Scripture, and the sacraments. The Council of Constantinople in 381 condemned Pneumatomachianism, along with Arianism, and added to the Nicene Creed the phrase about the Spirit who, quote, with the Father and Son is worshipped and glorified, end quote. Now, this entry is pretty brief because it's structurally a footnote to the Arian controversy, the same logic, the next person of the Trinity. The Pneumatomachian position was held, or at least entertained, by some genuinely respected figures before the Council of Constantinople finally settled the question. Basil of Caesarea, whose treatise on the Holy Spirit is a classical refutation, was so careful in his public statements about the Spirit's divinity that some of his allies thought he was conceding too much to the Pneumatomachians, while others thought he was being strategically cautious to avoid giving his Arian-leaning opponents a usable target before 381. While the Spirit's entry into the Creed, with the Fathers and the Son worshipped and glorified, was a political and theological achievement, requiring the same decades of patient argument that the Son's entry had required half a century earlier. Next up we have Apollinarianism, from the 360s to 381. Apollinaris of Laodicea, a bishop and friend of Athanasius, was trying to solve a genuine theological problem. If Christ has both a divine nature and a full human nature, including a human rational soul, then how do we prevent his two natures from being essentially two persons? Apollinaris had a solution that was anatomical. Christ had a human body and a human animal soul, but his rational mind was the divine Logos itself. He was therefore not two things awkwardly combined, but one integrated being with the divine mind directing the human body. He was condemned at the Council of Constantinople in 381. The counter-argument from Gregory of Nazianzus has become one of the most quoted axioms in Christological debate. Quote, what is not assumed is not healed. So basically, if Christ did not assume a full human nature, including the rational mind, then the human rational mind remains unredeemed. You get what I mean, right? Trying to explain this all in plain English, Theology is it's quite a deep topic. Now, the very part of the human being most in need of redemption, i.e. the seat of sin, the faculty of choice, would have been left untouched by the Incarnation. This argument closed Apollinarianism's theological option, but it opened the question that Nestorianism and Miaphysitism would spend the next 2 centuries answering. If Christ has a full human nature and a full divine nature, then what exactly is the relationship between them? The condemnation of Apollinaris didn't really resolve the problem he had tried to solve. It simply declared that his solution was unacceptable. The alternative, acknowledging a full human rational soul in Christ, immediately raised questions about how a human will and a divine will could coexist in one person, and whether they could have some conflict. These questions drove the Nestorian and Monothelite controversies of the next couple hundred years, and at least Apollinaris had tried to identify the problem with a bit of precision. Orthodoxy required a solution that kept the full humanity intact without generating the implications of a double personality, I suppose. So the council spent 3 more centuries looking for language adequate to that requirement. The 4 adverbs of the Chalcedonian definition, i.e. without confusion, without change, without division, without separation, are the summary of that search, and they define what orthodoxy is by listing what it is not, which is perhaps the most honest thing the tradition could have said at the time. Next up we have Priscillianism. Now, Priscillian was a Spanish layman of considerable wealth and education, who came under the influence of an Egyptian bishop named Magus from Memphis, who had brought ascetic and Gnostic-adjacent ideas to Spain. Priscillian gathered a following of men and women who practiced rigorous fasting, studied the apocryphal scriptures, and met in mixed-gender groups for prayer and study. His opponents accused him of Manichaeism, magic, and the standard smear of the period, nocturnal sexual irregularities. Interesting. Well, he became Bishop of Avila in Spain, which gave him a formal position from which his enemies in the Spanish episcopate could attack him at a council rather than simply complain. So he appealed to the Roman Church, and the Roman Church deflected. He appealed to the usurper Emperor Maximus, who had recently deposed and executed the legitimate Emperor Gratian, and Maximus agreed to help him out. Anyway, they put him on trial. That was the best help they could give to him. I suppose justice will have to take its course. So off they went, and the trial took place at Trier in 385. Priscillian was convicted of sorcery and immorality. Not immortality. That would be sorcery, right? Well, these were specific charges that went beyond doctrinal disputes. So they executed him, and they beheaded him, along with several of his companions. He was probably thinking it was better not to appeal to Maximus in the first place, but hey, had to roll the dice. So he is actually the first Christian to be killed for heresy by a Christian imperial authority, and the reaction was notable. Martin of Tours, the great bishop and ascetic who became the most venerated saint in medieval France, and Ambrose of Milan, one of the four original doctors of the Latin Church, both protested the execution vigorously. They thought Priscillian might be wrong, and they were appalled that he had been killed for it, just going too far. Siricius, the bishop of Rome, refused communion to the Spanish bishops who had pushed the persecution. Well, the execution caused genuine horror among people who disagreed with the victim. But it happened, and you can't put his head back on, right? It was more about the precedent that it set, that the state could execute a heretic at the church's instigation. It was not immediately followed, but it existed and it would be followed eventually, as we all know. Now, the specific theological content of Priscillianism is difficult to reconstruct because the sources are all pretty hostile, and because the charges leveled against Priscillian, i.e. Manichaeism, the nocturnal rites, and the magical practice, well, they just mean that things that he would have done are just blown out of proportion. They're sort of tarring him with a pretty bad brush. Now, what seems clear is that Priscillian and his followers practiced rigorous fasting, venerated the apocryphal scriptures, and held views about the soul and material world that may have leaned towards dualism. Whether any of this constituted genuine Manichaeism, or was simply the ascetic rigor that characterized many movements the Church eventually accommodated, is genuinely uncertain. But anyway, I suppose the legacy of it was the execution. That happened, and the theological basis was murky. The precedent it set was in the mud of that murkiness. Next up we've got Pelagianism from 400 to 431. Now Pelagius arrived in Rome from Britain around 380 with a reputation for ascetic seriousness and a concern that the Church's emphasis on grace was producing moral laziness. If God's grace does everything and human effort contributes nothing to salvation, why even bother to make the effort? His position was straightforward, that human beings have genuine free will, uncorrupted by original sin in any inherited sense. Each person sins by their own free choice. Grace assists the will, illuminates the mind, and removes past sins through baptism, But it's not the irresistible force Augustine would later make it. Humans can, if they choose, live without sin. He was initially respected in Rome. Jerome knew him and initially praised him. He left Rome when the Visigoths sacked the place in 410 and eventually settled in North Africa, where he encountered Augustine and where the controversy would reach its full intensity. Augustine of Hippo's response to Pelagius shaped Western theology more profoundly than almost any other single theological controversy could. In refuting Pelagius, Augustine developed his mature doctrine of original sin. Adam's sin radically damaged the human will, making it unable to choose good without divine grace. This grace is not given in response to foreseen merit, but according to God's sovereign and inscrutable election. Those who are saved are predestined to salvation. Those who are not, well, they're justly condemned for their own sins. The doctrine of irresistible grace, double predestination, at least implicitly, and the total depravity of the will without grace. All of this was forged in Augustine's polemic against a British monk who thought the people could be good if they tried to be. Pelagius was condemned at the Council of Ephesus in 431. Augustine's counterpositions have structured Western Christian consciousness ever since, and that's Catholic and Protestant. The heresy's refutation has shaped Western guilt, however, more than any heresy shaped anything else. Now, the semi-Pelagian position that emerged was a mediating option. Grace is necessary, but the initial movement toward God is a human contribution, not a divine gift to a passive will. It was associated particularly with the monastery of Lorraine in southern Gaul with John Cassian of Marseille. It was condemned at the Second Council of Orange in 529, which upheld an Augustinian position on grace. The practical irrelevance of this condemnation to the most subsequent Catholic theology is notable. The mainstream Catholic tradition did not in practice follow Augustine to the harshest conclusions about predestination and irresistible grace, but found a way to hold the Pelagian condemnation and the semi-Pelagian condemnation simultaneously, while teaching something that looks functionally closer to semi-Pelagianism than to Augustine. In theological terms, this is a pretty uncomfortable position, but pastorally it may be the only position a working church can realistically maintain. Next up we have Nestorianism. Nestorius, appointed Patriarch of Constantinople in 428, was a Syrian monk and preacher of considerable reputation, whose theological instincts were shaped by the Antiochene school, which tended to emphasize the fullness of Christ's humanity and was cautious about formulations that seemed to collapse the human into the divine. When his chaplain Andrew preached against the title Theotokos, literally God-bearer or Mother of God, applied to the Virgin Mary, Nestorius endorsed the position. Many bore the human Christ, or rather Mary bore the human Christ, the temple in whom the divine Logos dwelt. She was Christotokos, the bearer of Christ, not Theotokos. Now his underlying concern was precise. To say that Mary bore God risked implying that God began in time, that the eternal divine nature had a mother, that the Godhead itself was born as an infant. And that's a really good point when you think about it. Now Cyril of Alexandria, who regarded the Alexandrine theological tradition's emphasis on the divine unity of Christ as being under attack, moved swiftly and not always fairly. The Council of Ephesus convened in 431 to settle the dispute, and it was opened by Cyril before Nestorius's Syrian supporters had even arrived. Nestorius was condemned without a proper hearing. When the Syrian bishops got there and held their own counter-council, they condemned Cyril. The Emperor Theodosius II eventually ruled in Cyril's favor, exiling Nestorius to Egypt. The political dimension was explicit. Alexandria and Constantinople were the two greatest sees in the East, and the patriarchs of each had been engaged in a contest for presence that the Nestorian controversy had given Cyril the opportunity to resolve in Alexandria's favor, at least temporarily. The community that refused to accept Nestorius' condemnation became the Church of the East, centered around Seleucia, Ctesiphon, in Persia, outside the Roman Empire's reach, by the way. In Persia, the Church flourished without Roman interference. They developed their own patriarch, its own theological tradition in Syriac, its own ecclesiastical culture. And then it grew. It expanded eastward, down the Silk Road. By the 7th century, there were dioceses in Central Asia and India, even in China. The Xi'an stele, erected in 781, describes Christianity in the Tang dynasty, with the theological formulations that reflect the Church of the East tradition. A stele recording Christian theology in Tang China, set up a century before Viking raids in England, is the consequence of a council at Ephesus in 431. Talk about the butterfly effect, huh? Well, jumping a bit more forward in time, in 1994, the Holy See and the Assyrian Church of the East, the surviving descendant of the original church, issued a common Christological declaration. Its language acknowledged that both communions, quote, confess the same faith in the Son of God, and that the 431 dispute was largely a question of different theological emphasis and vocabulary. A heresy verdict of 1,500 years standing, softened by a communique, by the monthly newsletter. The Assyrian Church of the East has always rejected the label Nestorian. The 1994 declaration essentially conceded their point. So this entry sits in the coder's argument that the heresy list is partly a list of people the Church would later wished it had argued with instead. The Assyrians would have, I suppose, liked that conversation a bit better in 431. Next up, 451, Miaphysitism. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 produced the most consequential and contested Christological formula in Christian history. Jesus Christ is one person in two natures, human and divine, without confusion, without change, without division, without separation. End quote. End of argument. The four adverbs, the Chalcedonian definition, are a masterpiece of careful negation, ruling out Apollinarianism, which confused the nature, Nestorianism, which divided the person, and everything in between. A very solid rule. The council was attended by 600 bishops. Emperor Marcion attended in person. It appears to settle the question that Nicaea, Constantinople, and Ephesus had left open. But the problem was it split the church in half. The theological tradition centered in Alexandria and Syria, and Egypt and Ethiopia and Armenia had emphasized, ever since Cyril's victory over Nestorius, the unity of Christ's person in one unified nature, not two. Cyril's formula was, quote, one nature of the Word of God incarnate. Chalcedon's two-nature formula appeared to these Christians to be a step backward towards Nestorianism, an unnecessary and dangerous multiplication of natures. So they rejected the council. The word used by their opponents, monophysite, one nature, they regard as a misrepresentation. The term they prefer for themselves is Miaphysite, from the Greek mia, meaning one in the sense of unified, rather than the numerically singular. The theological nuance is real, and has been argued about by professional Christologians for 15 centuries. The communities that rejected Chalcedon are not obscure historical remnants. They are the Coptic Orthodox Church of Egypt, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Armenian Apostolic Church, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and the Eritrean Orthodox Church combined, and they represent approximately 60 million Christians today. So once again, not a fringe sect. The Ethiopian Church alone has 40 to 50 million members. These are among the oldest Christian communities in the world, with continuous traditions going back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, maintaining their theology and their liturgy through Chalcedon, through the Islamic conquest, through everything history put in their way. Calling their theology heresy in the present tense would require a level of institutional confidence that the current state of ecumenical dialogue doesn't support. Since 1990, a series of Christological declarations between Rome and the Oriental Orthodox churches have acknowledged convergence. The quote, heresy verdict has been substantially suspended without being formally withdrawn. But the imperial consequences of the Chalcedonian split were severe. Egypt was substantially anti-Chalcedonian. The emperor faced the choice of enforcing Chalcedon by force or finding a compromise formula that both sides could accept. The Henoticon of 482, Emperor Zeno's compromise, managed to alienate everyone. The Chalcedonians said it abandoned the council. The anti-Chalcedonians said it was weak and didn't go far enough. The consequent schism between Rome and Constantinople, i.e. the Acacian Schism in 484 to 519, is the first of the east-west ruptures that the 1054 schism would eventually make permanent. The effort to legislate theology by imperial decree reached its logical terminus in the Monothelite controversy, which we'll discuss now. So, Monothelitism, around the 7th century. Emperor Heraclitus, who had just reconquered Egypt and Syria from the Persians in the 620s, faced the same problem every emperor since Chalcedon had faced. His recovered provinces were largely anti-Chalcedonian, and imperial unity required theological unity, had to get everybody on the same page. So his formula, developed with the Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, was Monothelitism. Basically, Christ had two natures, conceding Chalcedon, but one singular will. This avoided the Nestorian-sounding implications of two wills that might operate interdependently, and attempted to satisfy anti-Chalcedonians by emphasizing divine unity. Problem is, it satisfied no one. The theological objection from the Chalcedonian side was the same as Gregory of Nazianzus' objection to Apollinaris. If Christ had no human will, then the human will remains unredeemed. Maximus the Confessor, a monk theologian, nice dual class there, refused to sign the monothelite formula with a clarity and patience that his opponents eventually found to be quite intolerable. So Maximus was tried for treason, opposition to the imperial theological formula that had become by this point the legal equivalent to political sedition. So they mutilated him. His right hand was cut off so he couldn't write, his tongue cut out so he couldn't preach. He died in exile in 662, still refusing to cooperate. Of course, he was vindicated posthumously at the Third Council of Constantinople in 681, which condemned monothelitism. A little bit late, but, better than nothing. The council also condemned posthumously Pope Honorius I, who had written a letter in 634 that seemed to endorse the monothelite formula. A dead pope condemned as a heretic by a council. Now, that doesn't happen very often. Well, all of this was extensively discussed at the First Vatican Council of 1870, when the definition of papal infallibility required careful distinction between the Pope's personal theological opinions and his formal definitions of faith. Honorius I is the thread that connects the monothelite controversy to modern debates about what the papacy can and cannot do. Now, Maximus the Confessor is one of the most morally serious figures, not because his suffering was uniquely severe, which it was not, but because the source of his suffering was so nakedly revealed. He was not accused of holding a doctrine contrary to scripture or tradition. The charges against him were framed as treason, and the treason consisted of refusing to endorse the emperor's theological formula. The formula was imperial policy. Dissent from imperial policy was sedition. The torture was the state's response to sedition. What Maximus clarified by his refusal was the specific nature of Constantine's gift to the Church, i.e., imperial power could enforce theological conformity, but it could not compel theological agreement. The two things are different, and the difference between them, between compliance and conviction, is the gap in which the entire history of conscience operates. And so from the Armenian highlands through the Bulgarian villages to the cities of Languedoc, a single idea appears and reappears across 5 centuries, that the visible world is made by a wicked or incompetent divine power, and the God of the New Testament is trying to rescue those trapped within it. Whether this all traveled as a connected tradition or happened independently in different contexts is, the scholarly question that we'll have to talk about honestly. What is certain is that the movements which carry it share characteristic features: rejection of sacraments of the established church, the rejection of the material cross as a symbol, ascetic rigor in their elite members, a non-violent relationship to ordinary society that makes the violence eventually directed against them to seem strategically disproportionate. Well, the thread connecting the Paulicians of Armenia to the Bogomils of Bulgaria to the Cathars of Languedoc, if it is a thread at all, is one of the most contested questions in the study of medieval heresy. The romantic version of the story is a tradition of dualist resistance, carrying its secret knowledge from the mountains of eastern Anatolia westward across 1,000 years and 1,000 kilometers. The scholarly version is more tentative. Some ideas probably traveled some of the distance through specific channels. Other similar ideas, may have arrived at similar conclusions independently. And the inquisitorial interrogation process that produced the documents we have may retrospectively have imposed a coherence that the movements themselves did not possess. So let's talk about both versions honestly. First up, the Paulicians. They emerged in Armenia and eastern Anatolia in the 7th century. Their name probably derived from the Apostle Paul, though some claimed later derivation from Paul of Samosata. They rejected the Old Testament, the material cross, infant baptism, the church hierarchy, the veneration of Mary, and the Orthodox sacraments. There's not much left after that, isn't there? Well, their theology was dualist in some versions, the material world as the creation of an evil power, though the precise degree of their dualism is contested in the sources, which are almost entirely hostile Byzantine chronicles. What is not contested is that they became a significant military power on the Byzantine Arab frontier, building fortresses and fighting with considerable effectiveness against the imperial forces sent against them. The Empress Theodora's campaign against the Paulicians in the 840s and 70s was the most sustained imperial effort yet directed against a heretical community. The Byzantine chronicles claim approximately 100,000 Paulicians were killed, and that's a number to treat with caution, by the way, as Medieval casualty statistics routinely need a bit of caution, but it is indicative of a campaign of genuine severity. The communities that survived this campaign were not exterminated but relocated. Emperor John Zimisces deported substantial numbers of Paulicians to Thrace and Macedonia in the 970s, seeding the region with a population whose religious traditions included dualist tendencies. Now, whether those traditions directly shaped what emerged in Bulgaria a generation later is the question the transmission entry will address, I suppose. Now, what the Paulician case most clearly demonstrates is the military and political capacity that a heretical movement could develop when the empire's frontier produced the right conditions. The Paulicians were not passive mystics enduring persecution. They built fortresses, trained armies, and allied with the Arab powers across the border against the Byzantine Empire that was persecuting them. Their fortress at Tefrike was a military installation of genuine significance. This is the only entry in this last few heresies where the heretics were as dangerous to the imperial state as the imperial state was to them, and the scale of the eventual crackdown, the claimed 100,000 dead figure, shows that the Paulicians were being treated as a military problem as much as a theological inconvenience. The forced deportation of survivors to the Balkans was a strategic decision. It removed a military threat from the eastern frontier, and incidentally, it seeded the Balkans with the population whose ideas would eventually produce the Bogomils. Talk about them a little bit later. But first, let's talk about good old Iconoclasm. On or around 626, Emperor Leo III ordered the removal of the image of Christ that hung above the Chalcedon Gate. That's the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace in Constantinople. The official response from the populace of Constantinople was violent enough that an official was killed in the ensuing riot. But Leo proceeded anyway, and inaugurated the first Iconoclasm imperial policy, declaring the veneration of icons to be idolatry, i.e. the painted images of Christ and the saints that had become central to Byzantine devotional life, and still are. Well, they said that this was now a violation of the Old Testament prohibition on graven images. Iconoclast bishops destroyed images in their dioceses. Iconophile bishops didn't. John of Damascus, riding safely outside the imperial territory under Arab rule, produced the most sophisticated theological defense of icons. The Incarnation changed the relationship between the divine and the material. God had taken on matter, so matter can now carry the divine image. The first iconoclasm ended in 687 when Empress Irene, ruling as a regent, convened the Second Council of Nicaea, the Seventh Ecumenical Council, which restored the veneration of icons and distinguished between latria, a worship due to a god alone, and prosokinesis, or dulia, the veneration appropriately given to icons. The second iconoclasm ran from 814 to 843, when Empress Theodora finally restored icons and inaugurated the, quote, triumph of orthodoxy, still celebrated on the first Sunday of Lent in every Eastern Orthodox church today. Iconoclasm's two periods of imperial favor and two periods of condemnation make it the clearest single demonstration in this account of the principle that heresy is whoever loses the last round. Funny how that works, Now, the same theology that was imperial orthodoxy in 750 was all of a sudden heresy in 800, and back to imperial orthodoxy again in 820, and then back to heresy for good in 843. The theology never changed, but the emperor did, and that's who's really calling the shots. Now, the iconoclast controversy also clarified a distinction that Byzantine theology made central to its defense of icons: the difference between the prototype and the image. Now, John of Damascus argued that venerating an icon of Christ was not worshipping the painted wood, but directly honoring the person depicted. The image of the prototype shared a name and honor, but the nature of the wood and the nature of Christ were not confused. The argument drew on the same Chalcedonian logic that the council had used about Christ's two natures. The material and the divine could be united without any confusion. So, if we look at it that way, the iconoclast controversy is not a footnote to the Christological debates that preceded it, but their practical consequence, because once you have defined how the divine and human relate in Christ, you've also defined how the divine can or cannot be represented in material form. The iconoclast dispute is applied Christology, and the Orthodox Church's understanding of the icon as a theological statement rather than a devotional aid is the living outcome of the argument this act was all fought over. Now, the iconoclast controversy also shows the structural relationship between the Eastern and Western churches at the moment before their permanent estrangement. When Leo III ordered the removal of images, Pope Gregory II and his successor, Gregory III, protested with considerable vigor, and Gregory III called a Roman synod that condemned iconoclasm, the first direct papal condemnation of an imperial theological policy. Leo retaliated by transferring Calabria, Sicily, and Illyricum from Roman ecclesiastical jurisdiction straight to Constantinople. The Second Council of Nicaea in 687, which restored icons, was convened by an Eastern empress and ratified the Eastern traditions theology. Charlemagne's court at Aachen issued the Libri Carolini, dismissing the council's conclusions as inadequate. The theology of images was one of the fracture lines along which the East and West were already pulled before 1054 made the whole thing come to a proper fracture. Now let's get on to the Bogomils. Sometime in the mid-10th century, a Bulgarian village priest named Bogomil began preaching a theology that his ecclesiastical superiors found alarming enough to report to the Bulgarian Tsar. Now his name roughly means beloved of God, from the Slavic bog, God, and mil, dear. His doctrine, as reconstructed from the hostile account of the priest Cosmas, who wrote a polemic against him in 972, held that the visible world was created not by God, but by Sataniel, God's first-born son, who had fallen from heaven. A reading of Genesis in which the Creator God and the fallen angel are the same being. Christ was God's second son, sent to redeem what Sataniel had made. The physical world, including the human body, is Sataniel's creation, and therefore fundamentally alien to the spiritual. The practical consequences were systematic. The Bogomils rejected the Old Testament as Sataniel's scripture, with some exceptions. They rejected water baptism as a material sacrament. They rejected the physical cross as an instrument of torture rather than glory. And they rejected the church hierarchy as Sataniel's institution, along with prayers to Mary and the saints. Once again, not much left to work with, isn't there? They also had an inner circle, those who had received the spiritual baptism, laying on of hands, and an outer circle of ordinary believers. They were known for their mild manners, their refusal of meat, the avoidance of oaths, and their apparent holiness. Cosmas describes entire Bulgarian villages abandoning their priests and churches to follow them. The movement spread westward through the Balkans, reaching Serbia, Bosnia, and Constantinople itself. In Bosnia, the Bogomil tradition proved durable enough that the medieval Bosnian church, which may or may not have been straightforwardly Bogomil, but was certainly independent of both Rome and Constantinople, persisted as a distinct entity until the Ottoman conquest. Now, the most dramatic single episode of the Byzantine encounter with Bogomilism is the case of Basil the physician, who had built a substantial following in Constantinople around 1100. Emperor Alexios Komnenos invited him to a private audience, pretending interest in his teachings and feigning a desire to convert. Secretaries concealed behind a curtain took notes, as Basil, believing himself among potential converts, explained his doctrine fully. He was arrested, and they burned him in the Hippodrome around 1118. Now, the anecdote has a quality of entrapment that would recur in the Inquisition's later methods. The heretic caught not by open confrontation, but by the manufactured intimacy of a false conversion. A linguistic footnote that the outline should permit, by the way. The word Bogomil became Bulgar in medieval French, meaning Bulgarian, from which Bulgra, meaning heretic, by the same etymology, brought bugger into English. Now, the word retains its Bulgarian origin, but via the Bogomils in every language that uses it. The social appeal of Bogomilism to its original Bulgarian audience is not too difficult to understand. The Bulgarian church was a foreign institution. It had been established by Byzantine missionaries working in a language that was Greek rather than Slavic, and its leadership remained substantially Greek in culture and orientation. The Bogomil rejection of that church, its hierarchy, sacraments, and authority, was simultaneously a theological position and a national one, a refusal of the Greek cultural apparatus that had come with Christianity. Bogomil himself preached in Bulgarian. His movement gathered in Bulgarian villages. The tradition he founded was, among other things, the first Bulgarian language theological tradition. Now, whether that partially explains the durability is a reasonable inference from the pattern of the movement's spread. But next there's another question, before we move on, and that is, did Bogomil missionaries bring dualist theology to southern France? As you know, we can't really talk about Cathars and all the rest without slightly mentioning the Bogomils. The romantic version of the story has been told often and told well. An underground of the pure, maintaining the counter-church from the Armenian highlands through the Balkans all the way to Languedoc. Well, the evidence is thinner than it appears. Two documents are usually cited: the Interrogatio Eonasus, a cosmological text apparently shared between Bogomil and Cathar communities, and a report of a council held at Saint Felix de Caraman in 1167, at which a Bulgarian bishop named Nisitas allegedly presided and reorganized the southern French dualist communities. The Saint Felix document, rediscovered in the 17th century, has been argued by some scholars to be an 18th century forgery. Now, the historian Mark Gregory Pegg has argued in a body of work that's substantially reshaped the field that Catharism as a coherent imported religion is largely an inquisitorial construction, at least in terms of having a consistent theology and organized structure along with a traceable genealogy from Bulgaria. You see, the Inquisition interrogated people in Languedoc by asking specific questions derived from its assumption that a heretical church existed with consistent beliefs. The prisoners answered the questions, often under duress, and the answers were recorded as evidence of a coherent heresy. Peck's argument is that the inquisitors may have helped create the picture that they then persecuted. That what actually existed in Languedoc was a diverse landscape of anti-clerical religiosity. Local holy men and women and individual rejection of particular church teachings, all of which the Inquisition's questioning cohered into a theology and attributed to a church. Now, this argument does not resolve the question of whether southern French dualists had Balkan connections. It rather just flags, honestly, the question is genuinely open. The romantic story of a connected underground may be partly a story, and the rest of the act should be understood with that qualification in mind. So let's move on. Western Europe, between roughly 611 and 1000, rather, produced almost no significant heretical movements, and this is sometimes attributed to the relative simplicity of the early church's medieval relationship with its population, the medieval church's relationship, rather, sometimes to the wholesale destruction of literate culture in the migrations period, and sometimes to the absence of the conditions that tend to generate theological dissent. When I talk about the conditions, we're talking urban populations, literate lay people, and contact with alternatives. They're usually the trinity of heresy, pardon the wording. Now, whatever the explanation, the situation changed dramatically in the 11th century. Cities grew, literacy spread, trade resumed, and with trade came contact, and with contact came comparison. The church's visible wealth and political entanglement became objects of sustained popular disgust. The first burnings for heresy in the centuries occurred in 1022. Within 200 years, the church had founded the Papal Inquisition. Now, this is not the first burnings, it's just they hadn't happened for a few hundred years, is what I mean by that. Now, what we're going to talk about in the following sections is this arc from the first burnings to the extinction of the movement that made the Inquisition necessary. The Church's response to this eruption of heterodoxy was the most systematic institutional development in the history of persecution of belief. The crusade as a domestic rather than foreign instrument. The mendicant, particularly the orders like the mendicant orders and the Dominican orders, deployed as a theological police force, and eventually the permanent institution of a papal inquisition. Now, the Inquisition was not an improvisation. It was a carefully designed system with procedures, archives, appeal mechanisms, and manuals of instruction. Bernard Gui, the most famous medieval inquisitor, wrote a manual, the Practica Inquisitionis, that specified exactly how to conduct an interrogation, what questions to ask, and pretty much just, step 1, 2, 3, 4, this kind of thing. Well, let's talk about the first burnings, okay? In December of 1022, a group of men and women associated with the Cathedral of the Holy Cross at Orléans in France were burned by the order of King Robert the Pious. They included educated clergy, cathedral canons, and the confessor of Queen Constance, who had apparently gathered around a private practice of scripture study and theological discussion that had moved into the territory that the kings and bishops found to be not to their liking. Their beliefs, as reported by hostile sources, it must be said, include the denial of the virgin birth, denial of physical resurrection, rejection of the material sacraments as effective, and some form of spiritualist or dualist theology. Now, whether they had a connection to the Bogomil traditions or arrived at their positions independently, we don't know. But in any case, the proof is in the pudding because 13 or more were burned after refusing to recant these views. A comparable case at Montfort at Piedmont around 1028 produced another group of well-organized ascetics, apparently led by a countess, who were discovered by the Archbishop Ariberto of Milan. They practiced sexual abstinence, vegetarianism, common prayer, and their communal prayer, and their theology included what the sources describe as dualist elements. Some were burned, others apparently got away, they escaped, lucky for them. But these two cases are the first executions for heresy in the medieval Latin West in approximately 400 years. They were not immediately followed by others. The institutional apparatus for systematic prosecution did not yet exist, but what they established was the template. Educated people gathered in private association, maintaining an alternative religious practice outside the official church, discovered and destroyed. The machinery for repeating this on a larger scale would begin to be built. The Orleans case is also notable for what it reveals about the social location of heterodoxy in the early 11th century. These were not peasants, they were not artisans, they were cathedral clergy. They were literate in Latin, they had access to the full theological tradition of the church. The suggestion that their ideas had Eastern connections is possible but unproven. But what is clear is that sophisticated heterodox ideas were circulating in the most literate and institutionally connected circles of the Western Church in 1022. And that means that the Church's own educated class were not immune to theological alternatives. The early 12th century produced a series of charismatic itinerant preachers across France and the Low Countries, who exploited popular disgust with clerical wealth and corruption. Ankelm of Antwerp gathered enormous crowds in Flanders and Zeeland, preaching that the sacraments of sinful priests were worthless, and that the true church was wherever the Spirit gathered the faithful. He collected donations on a scale that alarmed civil and ecclesiastical authorities. He kept a companion he treated as a human embodiment of the Virgin Mary, which is admittedly a little strange, but okay. So he was eventually killed, probably by a priest around 1115. Peter of Bruy burned crosses across southern France on the grounds that the church, or rather the cross was the instrument of Christ's torture and had no claim to be venerated. He cooked meat over a bonfire of crosses at Saint-Gilles on Good Friday, and was thrown into the fire himself by an enraged mob of bystanders around 1135. Not happy to see the crosses burning, I suppose. Henry of Lausanne was one of the most durable of the three, wandering southern France for decades, preaching an anti-clerical gospel. Priests who kept concubines or accepted payments for sacraments had forfeited their ministerial authority. Marriage was a purely personal covenant, requiring no ecclesiastical ceremony. Infant baptism was meaningless because infants can't consent. Yeah, fair enough. So he was imprisoned, released, continued preaching, gathered followers in Le Mans, Lausanne, and ultimately the Count of Toulouse territory of Provence. Bernard of Clairvaux himself went to Le Mans in 1145 to preach against Henry and counteract his influence. Well, counteract he was, because Henry was eventually arrested around 1148, and he died in prison, probably starving to death or getting tuberculosis or something like that, probably. So none of the three were theologically sophisticated in the way Arius or Pelagius had been. Their appeal was pretty moral, not intellectual. But they worked because the institution they criticized was visibly corrupt and failing its own stated ideals. So it wasn't a stretch for people to throw their lot in with these three. But pause for a minute on the wandering preachers as a type rather than treating them individually, because they do reveal a structural feature of the relationship between popular religiosity and the institutional religion in the 12th century. The appeal of Tanquil, Peter of Bruy, and Henry of Lausanne was not primarily doctrinal. It was all pretty base level, surface stuff, They embodied visibly and dramatically a rejection of what the church had become, saying the things that everyone was too scared to say. And, well, the common man tends to understand things in simple terms. There's nothing wrong with that. Of course, the theological content was not really important. It varied. But all of the moral content was very consistent. And what the church learned from each case was that preaching of this kind required a licensed institutional alternative. Hence the Franciscans and Dominicans of the following century, who were poverty-practicing mendicants with papal authorization. The wandering preachers just created the demand that the mendicant orders were designed to meet. Well, next let's talk about Arnold of Brescia, a student of Peter Abelard at Paris and later a canon at Brescia in Lombardy. His position was not theologically deviant in a Christological sense. I mean, he accepted Orthodox doctrine on the Trinity and the Incarnation, but ecclesiologically, it was quite radical. Ecclesiological, another one of those difficult words, huh? Well, the church should hold no property, they should wield no temporal power, and exercise no civil jurisdiction. These were his main beliefs. Now, clergy who did own property had forfeited their apostolic authority. And then there's the Pope. He was a man of blood and flesh and a lover of gold, not a shepherd of souls. Now, these ideas were not new. They appear in various forms in the wandering preachers and will appear again in the Waldensians and Franciscan spirituals. But Arnold's combination of theoretical clarity and political effectiveness made him uniquely dangerous. He arrived at Rome in 1145 and became the intellectual and rhetorical spine of the Commune, the citizens' assembly that had expelled the Pope and was attempting to govern Rome as a republic on the model of classical antiquity, back to the good old days, perhaps. Pope Eugenius III was forced out of the city. His successor, Adrian IV, the only English pope in history, by the way, Nicholas Breakspear, placed Rome under interdict, suspending all sacraments in the city, as a political weapon to force the Commune's submission. The Commune eventually expelled Arnold. Frederick Barbarossa, seeking a papal coronation and needing to clear a political inconvenience, captured him. He was handed to the Roman authorities, hanged and burned, his body thrown into the Tiber, so that no relics could be preserved and no martyrdom cult could form around them. This specific precaution, destroy the body, remove the relic, preempt the saint, recurs with some of the most political threatening heretics, as itself is an admission of how the cult of martyrdom seems to have worked. I mean, that's the thing. Usually when people are saying, they're going to kill us for our beliefs, they're going to come after us, just like they did Christ. And when people do come after them and kill them for their beliefs, well, it tends to prove people right, doesn't it? More than it proves them wrong. Now, Arnold's political heresy is worth framing in precise terms. He did not deny the Incarnation, Trinity, or any doctrinal position the councils had defined. He denied the Church's right to temporal power, its ownership of property and civil jurisdiction, its political alliances with secular rulers. This ecclesiological position is arguably more comparable with the New Testament than the arrangement it was attacking. As Arnold's supporters did point out, the answer he received was not a theological refutation but an execution. The pattern would recur with Savonarola in 1498 and with Joan of Arc in 1431, both of whom were theologically orthodox in ways that Arnold was not, but were equally vulnerable to the instrument that the institutional church had developed for managing inconvenient individuals, and Arnold was certainly one of them. Now, speaking of inconvenient individuals, the Waldensians. Let's talk about them. Around 1173, a wealthy merchant of Lyon named Valdez, sometimes called Peter Valdez, though the Peter may be a later addition, heard a wandering storyteller sing the life of Saint Alexis, a wealthy Roman who abandoned his fortune and family on his wedding day to serve the poor, lived anonymously as a beggar outside his own parents' house, and was recognized only after his death. The account converted Valdez in the most literal possible sense. He had the Gospels translated into Occitan vernacular, distributed his wealth to the poor, and began preaching voluntary poverty in the streets of Lyon. He gathered followers, men and women, who became known as the poor of Lyon, and later, the Waldensians. They were not at this stage theologically deviant. They were Christians who wanted to live the gospel quite literally. At the Third Lateran Council of 1179, Valdez and his followers appeared before Pope Alexander III, who received them warmly and approved their commitment to poverty, but required that they obtain permission from their local bishop before preaching. The bishops of Lyon, predictably, didn't want to do that. They refused to grant it. Lay preaching was an ecclesiastical function, and not available to merchants. Doesn't matter how devout you are. The Waldensians continued preaching without permission anyway. They were excommunicated in 1184 by Pope Lucius III. The excommunication for preaching without a license rather than for a doctrinal error. You got a license for that preaching, mate. Anyway, was the hinge on which everything subsequently turned. Pushed outside the institutional church, the Waldensians began to develop positions that actually did diverge from orthodoxy. The rejection of purgatory, rejection of prayers for the dead, papal authority, that was a big one, and the affirmation of lay preaching as an evangelical rite. The heresy that the institutional church created by refusing to accommodate a lay preaching movement. Now, the persecution of the Waldensians across the following centuries is one of the longest campaigns of religious violence in Western history. They retreated to the high alpine valleys between Provence and Piedmont, the Cottian Alps, where their communities survived through periods of relative peace and the occasional massacre. In 1532, they affiliated with the Reformed Protestant movement at the Synod of Chanforan, receiving the Calvinist tradition's theology while maintaining their own distinct history. They produced the first French-language Protestant Bible. In 1655, the massacre of the Piedmontese Easter, in which Savoyard troops and the Catholic irregulars killed hundreds of Waldensians in their valleys, provoked John Milton to write one of the greatest protest sonnets in the English language. Oliver Cromwell sent diplomatic protests to the Duke of Savoy. They still exist. Their main institutional center is at the Tor Palice in the Piedmont Alps, and their church has approximately 30,000 members across Italy and South America. In June 2015, Pope Francis visited the Waldensian church in Turin and said, "In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, forgive us." So, the heresy outlived its judges by 840 years. Not bad. But the Waldensian case also shows the institutional church's complicated relationship with voluntary poverty as a theological vocation. Valdez was doing, in principle, what Francis of Assisi would do 50 years later, abandoning wealth, embracing poverty, preaching the gospel without institutional warrant. Francis survived the institutional encounter, and his order was approved. Valdez didn't, and his followers were excommunicated. The difference was partly theological. Francis was more careful about his relationship to episcopal authority. But it was also partly political because Francis had sympathizers in the Roman Church who managed his encounter with Innocent III. But the contrast between the two cases shows how narrow the path was between the apostolic poverty that the Church approved and the apostolic poverty that it persecuted. The same practice, the same scriptural foundation, just slightly different institutional navigations. One becomes a saint, the other becomes a heretic. It is what it is. Well, we got another big player now, slightly larger section. The Cathars. We talk about heresies. They're kind of one of the stars of the show. They didn't want to be a star of the show, but they certainly were. Now, the name given to them by their enemies was Cathari, okay, from the Greek katharoi, the pure ones. They called themselves the bons chrétiens, the good Christians, or bons hommes, the good men, sometimes perfecti for their inner circle. They flourished primarily in the Languedoc region of southern France, the territory from the city of Toulouse east to the Mediterranean coast, the land whose language was the Oc rather than the Uil, and in parts of northern Italy too. Now they were protected in the Languedoc. The southern French nobility that found them appealing decided to place them under their wing. They preached against a church that owned an enormous amount of land, and the nobility that protected them stood to inherit that land if the church lost it. This is not a complete explanation for the spread of Catharism, but it's certainly a part of it. But we have to give an honest caveat about the theological account of the Cathars, because it all comes from the inquisitorial depositions, records of prisoners answering an inquisitor's question under varying degrees of comfort. What emerges from those records, supplemented by a handful of surviving Cathar texts, is a theology of two principles: the God of the New Testament, entirely spiritual and good, who created the invisible world of souls, and a lesser or evil principle who made the material world. The soul is a spiritual being imprisoned in matter across successive lives seeking liberation. Now, the perfecti, who had received the consolamentum, a laying on of hands consisting spiritual baptism, had committed themselves to a life of absolute abstinence. So, no meat, no sexual intercourse, no oaths. The credentes, the ordinary believers, lived pretty normal lives, and they hoped to receive a consolamentum on their deathbed. The indura was the voluntary fast unto death that some perfecti undertook after receiving the consolamentum. Dying with it was preferable to living and risking its loss. Pope Innocent III launched the Albigensian Crusade in 1209, following the murder of his legate, Peter of Castelnau, by a retainer of the Count of Toulouse. The crusade was almost certainly not organized by any Cathar, but Innocent needed a pretext, and he had one. Now, the northern French nobility, led initially by Simon de Montfort, descended on the Languedoc with devastating effect. The sack of Béziers on the 22nd of July 1209 is the most famous episode of all. The legates asked how to distinguish Cathar from Catholic in a mixed city. The Cistercian abbot, Arnaud Aymery, is reported by the chronicler Caesarius of Heisterbach, writing some decades later to have replied, "Just kill 'em all and God will know his own." Now, the Latin phrase is "Cedite eos, novit emon dominus qui sunt eos." Now, whether those were his exact words, we don't know. Once again, he was writing later on. And perhaps they do represent the practical outcome. That is documented. I mean, the town was burned and thousands of its inhabitants were killed, including Catholic refugees who had taken shelter in the Church of the Madeleine. The estimate ranges from 7,000 to 20,000 dead in a single day. The crusade ground on for 20 years, reshaping the politics of southern France and transferring the Languedoc nobility's power progressively to the northern barons. Gregory IX established permanent inquisitors in 1231 and 33, choosing Dominican friars as the primary instrument. The Papal Inquisition, i.e. the inquisitional precursor of every subsequent inquisition, was founded specifically to address the Cathar question. Its methods, secret accusations, indefinite detention, the use of torture, were not improvised but systematically developed. The fortress of Montségur in the Pyrenean foothills was the last significant Cathar stronghold. It was besieged by a crusading force for 10 months from May 1243, and on the 2nd of March 1244 the garrison surrendered on agreed terms. The perfecti were given 2 weeks to prepare themselves. On the 16th of March 1244, approximately 225 perfecti, who refused to recant, were burned in a field below the fortress. The field of the burned, they called it, Prat del Cremat. Well, the last Cathar perfect, whose name and fate are known to history, was Guillaume Bellibaste, burned in Villeroy-d'Ermay in 1321. A movement exterminated, so thoroughly that the Inquisition had no more depositions to record, and historians now argue about what it had actually believed. Now, Mark Gregory Peck, who we mentioned before, has argued in scholarship that has substantially altered the field, so thank you for that Catharism is a coherent religion with consistent theology, organized structure, and continuous identity from Bulgaria to Languedoc, maybe largely an inquisitorial artifact. The Inquisition asked its prisoners specific questions derived from the assumption that a structured heretical church existed. The prisoners answered those questions, often after months of imprisonment and sometimes under torture. The answers were recorded as confirmations of what the Inquisition already believed. Pegg's argument is not that the people of Languedoc were Orthodox Catholics who were falsely accused, but that the coherent theology attributed to the Cathars may be partly the Inquisition's assembly rather than the heretics' own. Surviving sources are almost entirely generated by the institution that persecuted the movement, and that fact deserves to be held in mind throughout the more romantic version of the story. Next up we have the Amalricians. Aymeri of Ben, a theologian of the University of Paris, died around 1206, after his pantheist ideas had been condemned, i.e. the identification of God with all things, and the implication that every human being is in some sense part of the divine body. His followers continued teaching after his death, and were tried in 210. 10 were burned at the stake, a few others were locked up. The Amalrician position was pneumatological as much as pantheist. They believed the age of the Father and the age of the Son, i.e. Old Testament and New Testament, had passed, and the age of the Holy Spirit had arrived, in which the individual soul's union with God made external sacraments unnecessary. Aymeri's body was exhumed from its burial in consecrated ground and reburied outside it, the posthumous excommunication that the tradition occasionally visited on bodies it had missed while they were living. Now, the Amalrician case is also instructive about the relationship between academic theology and institutional tolerance at the University of Paris. Aymeri's initial condemnation came from within the university environment, and it was other theologians, not inquisitors, who identified his ideas as dangerous and criticized him. The subsequent trials of his disciples, conducted by the Bishop of Paris with assistance from papal authority, show the moment when the developing inquisitorial apparatus was applied to university theology for the first time. And it wouldn't be the last. The restriction of academic theological speculation was a recurring institutional project from the 13th century onward, and the University of Paris, which condemned Averroism, radical Aristotelianism by the way, and various other positions over the following centuries, became one of the sites where the boundary between legitimate inquiry and heretical conclusion was most actively and consequentially contested. Next we have Francis of Assisi, who had founded his order on absolute poverty. The friars would own nothing, individually or collectively, and would live entirely on charity. This was apostolic imitation, the life of Christ and the apostles literally reproduced. After his death, the order divided between those who maintained the absolute poverty as the rule's essence and those who accepted that a functioning institution required at least some property. Sure, you can see how that runs away on itself. Now the spirituals held the hard line. The conventuals accommodated the institutional reality. The specific theological question was crystallized. Did Christ and his apostles own property? Well, the spirituals said they didn't. The Gospels and Acts of the Apostles plainly show that. Several earlier popes had affirmed that Christ also owned nothing. So, Pope John the 22nd, in a series of pronouncements between 1322 and 24, declared the doctrine that Christ and the Apostles owned nothing to be heretical. This meant that Franciscans were now being burned for holding what their founder had plainly practiced. Michael of Cesana, the Franciscan Minister General, William of Ockham, and the political theorist Marsilius of Padua fled to the court of Emperor Ludwig of Bavaria, who was himself in conflict with John the 22nd. The Fraticelli, the more radical groups who refused obedience to the papacy entirely and continued consecrating their own clergy, were hunted through Italy and southern France for decades. Now, the irony of the spiritual Franciscan case is layered in a way that resists simplification. Francis of Assisi had founded the order explicitly on absolute poverty. Pope Innocent III had approved the rule that included his absolute poverty. Subsequent popes had affirmed that Christ owned nothing too. John the 22nd's reversal did not emerge from a theological vacuum, but rather reflected the papacy's interest in the Church's property rights at a moment when the spiritual Franciscan argument, if taken seriously, would have required the Church to divest itself of enormous land holdings. And good luck getting them to do that. The theological decision followed the institutional interest. So, these spirituals were burned for insisting that Christ owned nothing, in a trial conducted in a building owned by the Church, which seems more than a little ironic. Marguerite Porete. She was a Beguine member of a closely organized movement of laywomen who lived in religious lives of prayer, work, and charity, without formal vows or enclosure in a recognized religious order. The Beguine tradition was enormously widespread in the 13th century, particularly in the Low Countries and the Rhineland, and it occupied an uncomfortable position in the institutional Church's taxonomy. These women had lived apostolically, but they were outside any rule that the Church controlled. Margaret wrote The Mirror of Simple Souls, a profound work of mystical theology, describing the annihilation of the self in God. The soul in the highest stage of the divine union is beyond the mediation of the Church, beyond virtue in a conventional sense, and beyond sin. She was ordered to stop distributing the book. She did not, so they burned her in Paris on the 1st of June 1310. She refused throughout her trial to respond to the inquisitor's questions, This was legally significant. It constituted contempt for the Inquisition's authority, and quite personally revealing. She treated the proceedings with the serene indifference of someone who did not recognize the court's claim to her. The Mirror of Simple Souls continued to circulate anonymously in copies that made their way into the Carthusian and other monastic libraries. It was read devoutly for centuries by people who had no idea that its author had been condemned and executed as a heretic. In fact, they didn't figure that out until 1946, when an Italian scholar recognized the correspondences between the anonymous manuscript and the condemned text. The book that was burned outlasted the execution by 6 centuries. The Council of Vion in 1311 extended the institutional suspicion to Beguines generally, declaring their way of life potentially heretical, one of the broader crackdowns on unofficial religiosity that the Inquisition's momentum produced alongside these specific targets. Next up we have Gerard Sagarelli, who founded the Apostolic Brethren around 1260, a community of absolute poverty modeled on the apostolic life, wandering without fixed homes, subsisting on charity, imitating the apostles, as literally as Valdez had imitated them a century earlier. Spoiler alert, he was burned. It happened in 1300, after multiple imprisonments. And then Fra Dolcino took over the leadership and added a millenarian dimension. The corrupt church would be destroyed by a holy emperor. A purified church would emerge. The age of the Spirit was imminent. He gathered an armed community of several thousand people in the mountains of Novara and Piedmont, raiding nearby villages through the winters of 1305, 6, and 7 to survive. A crusade was called against them. The commune was systematically starved out during the winter of 1307, its members dying of cold and hunger. Dolcino and his companion Marguerite were captured in March of 1307. Their execution at Vercelli was designed to be instructive. They were paraded through the streets on a cart, while pieces of their bodies were cut off with red-hot pincers. Whatever remained of them was burned. Dante Alighieri, writing the Inferno in the years immediately following, placed Muhammad in the 9th Bolgia of the 8th circle of hell, among the sowers of discord, his body split open from chin to groin as a figure of schism he caused in the world. And from within this wound, Dante's Muhammad calls out to warn Fra Dolcino to stock up on provisions if he wants to avoid following Muhammad to hell. The warning went 3 years before it could be delivered. Dolcino is the last heretic in the medieval West to resist the church with armed force on a significant scale. The millenarian structure of Fra Dolcino's movement is a type that appears repeatedly in the late medieval heterodoxy and connects the Apostolic Brethren to the spiritual Franciscans, Hussites, and eventually to early Protestantism. The specific belief that the age of the Spirit was arriving, the institutional church would be swept away, was the most politically destabilizing form of theological heterodoxy, because it offered adherents a reason to resist institutional authority, not just passively but actively. If the present church is satanic and its replacement is imminent, cooperation is not merely wrong but spiritually treasonous. Communities that believed divine revolution was imminent were not manageable by the ordinary instruments of ecclesiastical discipline. Well, next up is one you probably heard of, John Wycliffe and the Lollards. Well, John was a philosopher, theologian, and eventually master of Balliol College at Oxford. He moved increasingly towards radical positions through the 1370s. The Bible is the supreme authority in matters of faith, above papal and conciliar pronouncement. The papacy as an institution has no clear scriptural mandate. The doctrine of transubstantiation, which basically means the bread and wine literally becomes the body and blood of Christ when it hits your tongue, is philosophically incoherent and clearly not scriptural. The Church should also hold no property. These were not novel ideas in themselves. We'd seen them before in almost every entry of this video. But what was novel was their combination with Wycliffe's academic standing. He had a platform at Oxford, and his protection by John of Gaunt was most powerful, or rather the most powerful nobleman in England, who found the critique of clerical property theologically useful and politically convenient. Good guy to have on your side. Now, Wycliffe inspired and supported a translation of the Bible into Middle English, the Wycliffe Bible, primarily produced by Nicholas of Hereford and John of Purvey. The first complete English Bible, by the way, so that's quite an achievement. Now, he died in 1384, peacefully with a stroke suffered while celebrating Mass in his church in Lutterworth in Leicestershire. The Inquisition had missed him. Too late. The Council of Constance in 415 condemned his writings, ordered his books burned, and agreed that his bones be exhumed. In 1428, 44 years after his death, the Bishop of Lincoln carried out the instruction. Wycliffe's bones were dug up from the church in Lutterworth, burned, and his ashes thrown into the river Swift that ran past the church. The symbolic violence of a posthumous execution is a system's confession that it had failed in real time. Thomas Fuller, a 17th century historian, observed that the Swift carried Wycliffe's ashes to the Avon to the Severn to the sea, and the sea around the world, an emblem of doctrine that no burning could contain. The Lollards, his followers, a term probably derived from a Dutch word for mumblers, applied mockingly to people who muttered prayers, continued Wycliffe's program among lay people and minor clergy across England through the 15th century. They circulated scriptural texts in English, held informal meetings, questioned transubstantiation and the veneration of images, and were periodically burned in small numbers when the episcopal and civil authorities had the will and opportunity to persecute them. The Bohemian connections, a diplomatic marriage between Richard II of England and Anne of Bohemia in 1328, brought Bohemian scholars to England and English texts to Bohemia. Jan Hus read Wycliffe's philosophical works in Prague. The ideas that travelled from Oxford to Prague were the same ideas that would return, with an army this time, when Bohemia refused to let them be heard out and, well, wasn't quite happy with watching people being burned, I suppose. Now, the Lollard movement's most remarkable aspect is its social breadth. Lollardy was not a movement of the dispossessed. You had a little bit of everything. The rich, the poor. You had minor gentry, merchants, artisans, literate craftspeople, alongside the rural poor and the minor clergy. The possession of English scripture was its sacrament and its currency. Communities gathered to read, discuss, and dispute the clergy's teaching against what they found when they read for themselves. Now, the specific content of the heterodoxy varied. Some denied transubstantiation, some rejected the veneration of images, some questioned the authority of the papacy, and some combined all three of them. So this is the movement that the Reformation would build upon, and the Lollard communities that survived into the 16th century provided some of the first English Protestant congregations. Pretty important stuff. And next up we've got Jan Hus, who was a master at the University of Prague and the preacher at the Bethlehem Chapel, a church specifically built for preaching in Czech rather than Latin, which made Hus a national figure rather than merely an academic one. He drew heavily on Wycliffe's theology, particularly on the critique of clerical wealth and papal authority, and he was a gifted preacher in a language his congregations actually spoke. Kind of helps when people understand you, right? The specific controversy that precipitated his trial was communion in both kinds. The Catholic practice of the late medieval period that gave the laity only the bread, not the wine at the Eucharist. This was basically the thing that the trial was based upon. The whole controversy, the disagreements. Now Hus and his followers, the ultraquists from the Latin sub utraque specie, under both kinds, demanded the chalice for the laity as the scriptural practice. The chalice became the symbol of the Hussite movement, carried on their banners and painted on their churches. Emperor Sigismund offered Hus an imperial safe conduct to attend the Council of Constance in 1414 to defend his positions. Hus accepted, perhaps naively, and arrived in Constance, where he was arrested. The council ruled that safe conducts issued to heretics were not binding, since heretics were outside the law that safe conducts protected. Hus was given a hearing of sorts, I suppose, but the hearing was structured to extract a recantation rather than to evaluate arguments. He refused to recant positions he did not believe were wrong, and he was burned at Constance on the 6th of July 1415, singing hymns as the flames were lit. His last recorded words before the fire reached him were, quote, "God is my witness that I have never taught what I have been accused of. I am dying for the truth of the gospel." His ashes were thrown into the Rhine, the same precaution taken with Arnold of Brescia and Wycliffe, the same acknowledgement of what ashes could become. So what happened next is the part that receives insufficient attention in standard accounts of the Hussite controversy. Bohemia did not accept the verdict. The death of Hus provoked a national revolt that lasted 15 years and defeated every military force the papacy and empire sent against it. Jan Žižka, a Czech nobleman who lost first one eye and then the other during the wars but continued to command effectively even after total blindness, developed the Wagenburg, the wagon fortress, a mobile defensive formation of armored wagons from which crossbowmen and handgunners could fire. It defeated the larger and better equipped crusading armies 5 times in a row. 5 crusades were called against Bohemia, and 5 of them were defeated. The Council of Basel negotiated with the Hussite leadership in 1432, the first time the Catholic Church had actually negotiated with heretics and made doctrinal concessions. The Compacts of Basel in 1436 granted the Bohemian Church the right to communion in both kinds. It was not everything the Hussites had demanded, but it was a concession extracted by heretics from the institution that had burned their leader. John Paul II in 1999 expressed deep regret over the burning of Jan Hus, a near apology for a heresy verdict that had produced one of the most consequential military theological revolts in medieval history. So the Bohemian Reformation did not end in 1436 with the Compacts of Basel. The Hussite tradition split into factions during the wars: the Ultraquists, the modern majority who sought accommodation with Rome; the Taborites, the radical wing centered at the fortress of Tabor, whose millenarian theology and military organization under Žižka made them the most feared army in Europe; and the Bohemian Brethren, who eventually became the Unity of Brethren, a community of radical discipleship that survived underground and eventually affiliated with the Reformation tradition, and is one of the ancestors of the Moravian Church that still exists today. So Jan Hus burned in 1415, and he produced a tradition that is still practicing in the 21st century. The council that burned him would have not predicted that outcome. Next up, we've got Joan of Arc, who was burned in 1431 but canonized in 1920. Joan of Arc was burned as a heretic in the marketplace of Rouen, 30th of May 1431, at approximately 19 years of age. The primary theological charges that stuck were two. She claimed to receive divine messages directly through the voices of Saints Catherine and Michael, bypassing the authority of the institutional church, and she had persistently worn men's clothing, which was condemned as contrary to divine and natural law. An ecclesiastical tribunal under the presidency of Pierre Cachon, the Bishop of Beauvais, and operating under English political supervision, found her guilty and delivered her to the secular arm for execution. The English needed her dead, you see. She had lifted the siege on Orleans, driven the English from much of France, and secured the coronation of Charles VII at Rheims. And the heresy verdict provided the legal instrument for that. So, in 1456, a retrial ordered by Charles VII, who had an interest in not having been crowned through the agency of a convicted heretic, found the original verdict null and void. Joan was posthumously rehabilitated. The procedure, the charges, and the verdict were formally declared irregular. And in 1909 she was beatified. In 1920 she was canonized by Pope Benedict XV. Heretic in 1431, saint in 1920. She is perhaps the most compact demonstration of how the targets can move and shift. Now, the specific charge about wearing men's clothing, which appears in the formal condemnation alongside the graver theological charges, deserves a bit of a note too. It was, under the canon law of the period, a genuine offense. Deuteronomy 22:5 prohibited cross-dressing as an abomination. But Joan's initial recantation, which she signed to avoid burning, included a promise to return to wearing women's dress. She was subsequently found wearing men's clothing again in her cell. Some sources say she explained that no women's clothing had been provided to her. It's not like she could go and hit the shops for it. Now, the technical relapse into the lesser offense of cross-dressing was then used to condemn her as a relapsed heretic, which carried the mandatory death sentence, of course. Now, the mechanics of the condemnation are worth knowing because they reveal the specific combination of theological accusation and political execution that characterized the case. And because the 1456 retrial focused precisely on these irregularities, finding that the original proceedings had been conducted with willful disregard for canonical procedure. And last up, we've got Girolamo Savonarola, the Dominican prior of San Marco in Florence. One of the most structurally interesting figures we have because his heresy was almost entirely political. His theology was orthodox. His apocalypticism was intense, sure, but it wasn't deviant. He preached that Florence was called to be a new Jerusalem, that the corrupt church of Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, a pope whose personal and political conduct was indefensible enough that the application of an antichrist was not rhetorically unreasonable, would be destroyed by God's judgment, and that the moral reformation of Florence was both possible and necessary. When the Medici were expelled in 1494, he had effectively governed Florence for 4 years. The bonfires of the vanities, public burnings of mirrors, cosmetics, carnival masks, books, artworks, including a few attributed to Botticelli, by the way, were organized on Carnival Sunday, 1497 and 98, in the Piazza della Signoria. Alexander excommunicated him in 1497 as his prophesied chastisement of Italy failed to materialize on schedule. The Florentines turned against him. the oligarchs found common cause with the papacy, and he was arrested in 1498. He was tortured until he confessed to having invented his prophecies. Subsequently withdrew the confession, was tortured again, and was burned on the same piazza where he had the vanities burned. Hanged first, of course, then his body burned to prevent relic collection, 23rd of May, 1498. Now, his cause for beatification was opened in 1997 and has not proceeded. He exists in an official limbo that reflects the genuine institutional uncertainty about how to classify a man who was orthodox, visionary, and politically catastrophic for the papacy's opponents, and executed by a pope who was probably the nearest thing to an antichrist that had ever held office. Now, the bonfire of the vanities is the image most associated with Savonarola, and it has given him a specifically Philistine reputation that the evidence does not entirely support. The paintings reportedly burned included minor devotional items and commercially produced works. The major Florentine art collections were not destroyed. Botticelli's alleged contribution of some of his own works to the fire is mentioned in a biography after his death, but it can't really be verified. What the bonfire represents more accurately than a destruction of art is the quality of Savonarola's moral program. The rejection of the festive, the decorative, the luxury culture of the Medici court, in favor of an austere civic Christianity that identified worldly pleasure with sin. His constituency was real, and his diagnosis of Florentine corruption was accurate. His medicine, too strong. His prophecies were too specific, and when they failed to materialize on the prophesied scale, his credibility collapsed with them. And that's where we end it for our heresy movements, and like I said in the introduction, we are not really going to go into the Lutheran era, because, I suppose, so many heresies now were allowed to engage in heresy without being thrown on the fire, so there's plenty of heresies going on. Yeah, that's it from me today. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. Quite a long video, but I figured the topic needed it. Took ages for the guys to write the scripts up, so, thank you, and I will see you next time. Goodbye for now.